The dining room dropped into a kind of surgical silence the second Emily spun my laptop so everyone could see. The screen a small, unforgiving stage and 10 slightly opened mouths reflecting back in the glass like witnesses. I smelled turkey and that cheap disinfectant my mother always sprayed when she was nervous, the smell of lemon bleach trying to scrape out a lifetime of edges, and for the beat it all felt staged, too clean, too sharp, as if the house itself were waiting for a verdict. My pulse climbed with a slow, precise dread. I knew then I was watching a private life become public in a way that would not rewind. She flipped the browser so deliberately that the faint bounce animation of a new message on my desktop jittered like a small, embarrassed animal, and there it was. The top right corner showed 7:23 p.m. in a thin system font, the bank's brand colors peeking in the corner, and a checking account labeled business reserves with the number 12,350,000 in bold, black numerals so clinical they might as well have been a sentence. Below it, visible in the same window, a pending authentication contract for $585,000 sat under a header that read pending holder, Bennett & Co. Auth Consign, and a recent outbound transfer blazed a single line, $1,450,000 to Mortgage Relief J. Morgan. My quarterly client ledger ran across the lower pane, client initials, itemized estimates, and a last column that said cleared in green next to a string of dates. The cursor blinked, patient and small, like a heartbeat someone else could read. My mother Susan froze mid-chew with a fork caught over her plate, the mashed potato sliding back toward the mound in a slow, shameful arc, and the disinfectant smell seemed to multiply into something sterile and accusing. My father James made a choking sound that might have been a laugh if it didn't come out like a cough, and Aunt Lisa let her fork clatter into the pile of mashed potatoes, metal striking porcelain with sharp, embarrassed noise. Uncle Mark's face went flat and puckered. He checked his wineglass like he expected it to explain itself. Emily's expression was everything: thin victory pressurized by years of grievance, a half-smile that tasted like vindication, and when she leaned close to the screen and whispered, "This can't be right," her voice was both question and accusation. The chatter folded into sharp little blades, everyone trading ownership like it was a family heirloom they hadn't noticed before. "You never said anything," my mother said, voice incredulous but small, as if this was betrayal of trust rather than an overdue discovery. My father held his wine like it could be used to rinse the shock away and said, "How could you let us struggle?" in a voice that turned the word struggle into a moral accounting. Emily, louder, like she was trying to shape demand into fact, announced, "You owe us for everything we did for you." And the word "owe" landed in the middle of the table like a coin slapped down. I felt my mouth go cold and calm at once, an old practiced steadiness that sat next to an ache of anger, the two of them like tectonic plates shifting. Memory shelves clicked, disinfectant rules being sent away to Grandma Ruth if I had the slightest sniffle, being the invisible child, always the one who could be given away because I was fine and didn't require the fuss Emily did. The Hermes bag my mother always called a nice imitation sat on a chair back like a prop to their better selves. A box of pecan pie crumbs was still mostly untouched, proof that appetite had left the table. My leather briefcase, the faint logo barely visible in the lamplight, lay against my chair leg. The laptop's hinge had a small scuff from the subway once, and now that scuff was the hinge on a public airing, every private calculation suddenly legible. Voices braided into accusation and pleading, old arguments resurfacing as if they'd been waiting for a numerical excuse to breathe. Someone said, almost ritualistically, "We're family," as if uttering the word settled contracts and balanced books, and the claim felt like a demand for surrender. My hands moved without ceremony. I stood, zipped my leather briefcase shut, and slid the laptop closed with the gentlest of motions, a private coffin for the numbers everyone now thought were nails. I didn't leave with theatrical fury. I left tired in that specific way of people who have been asked to explain their existence so many times they stop expecting faith, just needing the space to be responsible for themselves. As I stepped toward the door, the oven timer grated somewhere behind us, the grinding hum of it like a metronome marking the moment, and I decided in that raw, instantaneous way that precedes action that I would walk out. Not to punish them theatrically, but because I couldn't be expected to justify my life for people who had spent it assuming I would always be the invisible ledger. The scene should end here, sharp and unanswered, and then pull up the curtain on the rest of my life in a rewind that explains why this particular ledger could ignite a room. I remember the night everything shifted like it was a camera cut back to black and white. Aunt Lisa at the door at 1:45 a.m. with a hospital bag and her voice folded small when she said, "They're here early," as if she were passing me a secret. I still smell that flash of hospital air, sharp antiseptic and the iron of fear. And then Emily, smaller than I expected, arrived hooked to tubes and oxygen with her blanket tucked up to her chin like armor. The house changed in an instant. Windows closed, the thermostat nudged down as if cold could keep illness at bay, and my parents moved through the rooms with the slow, exacting steps of people making a fortress. They turned our home into a sterile perimeter overnight. Hand sanitizer pumps on every flat surface like modern trophies, disposable surgical masks hanging on the hallway peg, and bleach-smelling towels stacked in every bathroom as if the scent alone could enforce safety. IV stands clinked metal against hardwood in the living room and then sat there steady by the sofa like sentries. My lavender air freshener, the one that used to make the car smell like summer, was taken down and put away because Emily might react. Which was how that house taught me my first lesson about being labeled hazardous without ever having one symptom. The new rule was blunt and immediate. A cough, a sniffle, any small human noise, and I was packed off to Grandma Ruth's with minimal fuss. At first it read like an adventure. Grandma Ruth's kitchen glowed with soft lamp light and smelled of butter and vanilla. She made cookies so warm they left steam on the counter when you set a glass beside them, and there was a Nancy Drew stack on her table that seemed endless and full of possibility. I learned to love the quiet of that house, the way she asked me about my day like it was important, the way she let me spread costume jewelry across a sheet and hand me a Sharpie to label old boxes. I cataloged something in her like it was my first true job. Names, maker's marks, little stamped hallmarks that looked like secret languages, every tiny fact a string I could pull. Those visits became a pattern. Exile at the first sneeze, landing in a sanctuary that smelled like sugar and old wood. It was tender, and I owe Ruth more than I can measure for teaching me to organize and care for things other people ignored. But the kindness had a cost. Being the kid who was sent away for safety glued problem to me in a way that sank inward like a seed. Old neighbors would ask where Emily was, and my mother's reply would be a protective, anxious thing, not a measure of my worth. Susan learned feeding logs for Emily by heart and could tell you exact ounces and hours. More attentive to that roll of numbers than to the science fair results taped to my door. I brought home a science fair blue ribbon once and held it up like evidence of a life that existed outside the kitchen rules. My mother glanced at it politely, the smile thin and tired, and said, "Can you put it in the garage? Cardboard dust might bother Emily." That line landed like a small blow. My father, James, nodded as if it were doctrine and said, "Emily has to come first." The words not cruel but absolute, taught over years until they were unquestionable. Aunt Lisa volunteered to pick me up the next time I sneezed on the playground like she had a roster to keep. Nobody meant me harm, but everyone meant to prioritize survival, and the instructions they wrote for living did not include me as a full person. The lesson I learned was simple and corrosive. Make yourself small, useful, and quiet. I honed the skill of being helpful in unobtrusive ways so people would not have to expend more care than they already did. I learned to catalog feelings into boxes, to shrink them, label them neatly, and store them out of sight. Ruth's jewelry boxes taught me to read maker's marks the way other kids learned to read comic strips. I could tell a piece's era by the clasp, a maker by a tiny stamped star, and there was a kind of humility in letting objects speak first while I listened. Those hours with Ruth, boxes labeled in Sharpie, small notes about condition tucked in like bookmarks, were the first time I felt competent in something that felt private and mine. I felt gratitude for her steadiness and the refuge she offered, but alongside that gratitude grew a slow, hot resentment at how easily my life could be set aside for another's survival. That combination, thankful for the sanctuary and furious at being treated as a risk, became the foundation of who I would later become. Someone who could build order out of chaos, who would learn to make himself indispensable without asking permission. The childhood rule that I must shrink to keep peace turned into a skill of self-reliance, and the quiet of Grandma Ruth's kitchen became the first true draft of the life I would one day keep private and eventually protect. My bedroom at 16 looked like a small command center, color-coded notebooks stacked like battlements, a lamp that had burned out on too many midnight practices, and a scholarship letter folded and shoved in an old shoebox under the bed because I wasn't ready for anyone to find it. I learned to make light out of darkness in that room, turning study into a kind of armor. Every margin I filled held a small promise, and every checklist I made was a quiet argument with the house rules that had trained me to be unseen. I decided early that attention wouldn't arrive from home, so I built competence deliberately, like a machine. I got a 36 on the ACT by the skin of discipline and bad coffee, sending off applications at night with my own email, my parents' names nowhere near the forms. When Madison State called with a full scholarship, I printed the acceptance, folded it into the shoebox, and booked a one-way train ticket myself. The kind with a paper stub you kept in your wallet to prove you had left something behind on purpose. Work paid for the rest. I picked up double shifts at Frank's Diner 3 nights a week, stuck behind a counter that smelled like grease and cheap coffee until my hair smelled like oil. Carol, the diner owner with a laugh like a door hinge, started slipping me extra tips in folded bills and a plastic to-go bag with leftover pie when she saw me staring at the calendar trying to figure out how to pay for textbooks. The kitchen lights buzzed while I wiped tables and learned to fold napkins into shapes that felt like dignity. And the sound of the coffee machine at 5 a.m. became a kind of comfort instead of humiliation. Small things at home kept proving the pattern. My 16th birthday passed with a drive-by happy at the table while someone else asked about oxygen schedules, and my scholarship letter got a brief, distracted congratulations that was promptly eclipsed by a debate over Emily's special needs class schedule. My mother looked at my grades like they were a flow chart, precise but clinical, while she tracked feeding logs for Emily with more care than any of my award envelopes ever received. Those moments weren't dramatic, they were laundry. They taught me that good news would not always be celebrated and that I had to be my own witness. College changed the size of the world, but not the way I had to earn my place in it. On campus, I was finally one student among many, no shadow sibling status to shrink into, and that anonymity felt like oxygen. I worked for the campus museum cataloging donations, a small paid internship that turned into late nights leaning over glass cases and learning the language of metal and stamp. A local donor dropped off a box marked costume and left without a second look, and I spent a week pulling apart brooches, pins, and chains, cross-referencing hallmarks in library databases until the library clerk knew me by name. There, under fluorescent lights and curling index cards, I found a brooch with a tiny, almost erased maker's mark that everyone else wrote off as costume. The pin's weight and the way the clasp articulated felt wrong for paste and cheap backings, so I researched. Months of nights in the stacks taught me to read era, solder joints, and the cadence of a hinge. My suspicion, small, stubborn, felt like a whisper at first and then a promise. Sometimes value hides very well, and sometimes people don't have the patience to look. Internships multiplied into better opportunities. I cataloged a donor's Victorian parure, learned to describe patina in sentences that read like tenderness, and realized that my obsessive labels and Sharpie habits were not quirks but skills. I learned to file provenance, to email politely phrased questions that probed the edges of a story, and to translate that into offers people trusted. My first real appraisal was a modest commission from a professor who'd saved family jewelry in a shoebox for decades. When I suggested a clean and tested valuation, he paid me with gratitude and a recommendation that opened a slow door. Graduation at my parents' house was as muted as any other milestone had been. A quick photograph, a good job murmured between an IV schedule update and a call for help with an appointment. I left with my degree in a folder and the exact feeling of being invisible but capable, like a tool chest behind a door. More than the diploma, I took with me a small professional suspicion that would not let go, the ability to see value other people missed, to read a maker's mark like a name. That suspicion would become the engine of something private and focused, a trade I would learn to keep to myself until it grew into what I needed it to be. Fluorescent lights clacked overhead in the dusty back room at Ridge and Cole, and the air smelled of old paper and cedar like a promise waiting to be read. I remember the noise of boxes shifting, the whisper of plastic sleeves, and the feel of a stack of costume jewelry boxes that had been packed and repacked for decades, each one giving off a faint, sweet cardboard dustiness that made the whole place feel like a forgotten museum. I learned to move slow there, fingers finding clasps, reading stamps the way other people read faces. My first job was concrete and relentless. Catalog estate sale lots, photograph nests of rhinestones until my eyes blurred, and type descriptions into an aging database that squeaked when you hit return. I learned to tell a real hallmark from a clever fake by making lists and testing hypotheses the way others did math problems. Mr. Bennett, my supervisor, sat behind a desk that looked like it belonged to someone who had survived 50 auctions and still had no patience with nonsense. He barely looked up from his phone most mornings, which made convincing him feel like pushing against glass. The Kingston estate came in as a stack of labeled boxes with auction tags and a note about a locked jewelry cabinet no one could open without the will reading. The mansion's inventory had a cinematic quality, rooms lined with silverware so bright they reflected the chandeliers, a study closed and still smelling faintly of cigar smoke, and a locked cabinet described in the inventory as family jewels. Do not move without oversight. They sent a key later, but the point was the same. These boxes had been untouched and therefore unexamined for a generation. I found the brooch in a shallow tray that looked like a thrift casualty, Art Deco lines, a strange weight in the palm, and a clasp that didn't match the cheap pins around it. The metal's coldness felt different under my thumb. I took it home that night on my lunch break and used the company's reference books and archived catalogs after hours, lit by the fluorescent hum and a desk lamp that burned blue. There are textures in metal you learn to read, the tiny hammer marks, a soldering bead in a hidden place, a maker's mark almost worn away to silence. I cross-referenced a nearly erased stamp with an old 1920s register in Ridge and Cole's archive and found a match to a short-lived atelier none of the newer appraisers seemed to know. I bought a primer gemology course with money I'd been saving from diner shifts and overtime hours, the kind of small investment that felt huge because it was private and mine. Nights I stayed later at the auction house, scrolling library databases and photographing the piece under different lights to show how the paste behaved like actual paste and the clasp moved like a high-quality hand-forged hinge. I printed pages, annotated them with a blue pen, and stapled a packet that had in it condition reports, hallmarks, price comparables, and an outline of provenance possibilities. It was methodical, quiet work that looked like obsession until it wasn't. The morning I walked it over to Bennett, he glanced up as if my file might be another routine note. I spread the stapled packet on his desk and began from the small things, the weight, the hinge, the obscure hallmark that matched an atelier with documented 1920s commissions. He read a sentence, then another. The skepticism in his face softened not into praise but into calculation, that same professional posture where curiosity overrides disbelief. He asked for photographs, called a conservator for a quick look, and then, on a Tuesday auction night, we put the brooch up as lot 312. I remember the hush that fell when the lot number flashed on the screen, the soft thud of the gavel when the bidding started, and the metallic breath of a sold lot when the final hammer came down. The room seated collectors who smelled like cologne and history, and phones rose like small flags. When lot 312 closed at $52,500, the sound the gavel made felt different, thicker, like a marker being set down. Mr. Bennett's casual respect changed shape. He clapped my shoulder once, brief and professional, and told me to write a report for consignment lids. That sale planted a seed more than it bought me anything. It turned whispers into questions and skepticism into trust. I was no longer just the quiet kid cataloging. I had become the person who could find a needle in a costume-rich haystack. The auction buzzed for weeks, offers and requests coming in with a new tone, and Mr. Bennett started sending me the odd estate note with 2 words underlined. Look closely, as if he were handing me a new tool. The thrill wasn't money alone. It was the first time my work made someone in my field see me for the person I knew I was becoming. The exact moment I decided to go all in felt ridiculous and absolute at once. I signed the high-interest loan papers against my old Honda, emptied my saving jar into a bank transfer, and put my signature on a lease for a tiny office above a Chinese takeout on East Market Street, where the odor of soy drifted up through the floorboards. The air in that hallway hummed like it didn't belong to me yet, and the Wi-Fi only worked if I leaned my laptop toward the single window while the steam from the kitchen fogged the glass in the cold months. Put that image at the top of the chapter so readers know how small and fragile the launch looked. Describe the office the way I saw it. A folding card table with a chipped laminate top as my desk, a salvaged office chair that squealed when I turned it, and printouts of hallmarks taped crookedly to the plaster like a parish of small important saints. Include the cheap safe I bolted behind a false panel I built myself with wood from a discarded pallet. No flashy vault, just a rusting metal box that smelled faintly of engine oil and old receipts. Make sure the cheapness of the setup carries weight. This isn't glamour, it's a negotiation with risk. Walk through the first months as a ledger of tiny braveries. Charging low fees to win the trust of cash-strapped collectors, taking weekend estate sale runs with a folding dolly, and reading gemology modules online at 2 a.m. with a cup of reheated diner coffee beside me. Show the physicality of the learning curve, my eyes adjusting to loop work, the ache in my hands from opening tiny screws, the stack of unpaid invoices under the teacup. Put in dialogue where clients question my rate and I answer with steady facts instead of promises. I can guarantee the identification, not the emotional value, I tell them, and that honesty becomes a brand. Introduce Jenna as an early hire who shifts the team dynamic. She's 24, smart, overlooked in her former shop, and takes meticulous photographs of pieces while humming off-key. Show the exact moment I trust her with a key and my first set of consignments. She asks a single tool question that makes me see a detail I missed, and you should include the small scene where I hand her an envelope and say, "Don't tell my family what this is," because secrecy will become a rule. Make Jenna a mirror of the younger version of me, hungry, capable, and quietly loyal. Stage the watershed moment with the regional dealer who walks into the office because of a quiet referral. He carries a battered corrugated box of Victorian stick pins labeled replica in a dealer's shorthand that means the pieces were written off. Show my 2-week dive. Nights in the office cross-referencing maker's marks with library microfiche, a visit to a conservator who humors my theory, and an obsessive spreadsheet where I track solder joints and pin lengths until patterns emerge. Include a scene where I call the dealer in plain terms, "You have two real ones here," and his silence is almost disbelief. When the sale closes, make the numbers feel earned and almost accidental. The sale nets my small firm a commission of $94,500, a figure that should hit like a punch but reads instead like a validation checklist in my head. Recreate the dealer's delight. He grips my hand, the handshake firm and unexpected, and offers a referral on the spot. "You find things," he says, like an acknowledgement that opens other doors. Show my exhaustion after the deal. I sit on the floor amid catalogs and tape and feel a tired, careful joy that has no applause. Keep the months gritty. Pay rent late more than once, jury-rig a lamp with electrical tape, swear at a printer that jams, and then laugh because what else is there to do? Let small victories pile up into a modest reputation. One caller from a Charleston estate, a museum conservator who emails, "Recommend your work." Let the reader see the pattern. Slow accumulation, quiet competence, and a bank balance that grows in a private account I open under a truncated business name to keep it off family radars. End this part on the decision I made and the lie I crafted. I told my family I worked at a vintage shop when pressed, and I learned to answer their questions in vague, safe sentences that didn't invite follow-ups. I tucked my growing balance into that private account and watched the ledger become a line of defense. Make the emotional turn clear. This secrecy is not only practical, it's protective. Close the chapter with the exhausted joy of someone who chose risk and saw it begin to pay off, and set up the tension that secrecy can both save and trap you. I made the transfers precise because money likes rules. $6,200 hit my parents' account on the first of every month for 2 years, the memo reading from Aunt Ruth or sometimes household assistants, so the line would look ordinary on their statements. I set it up from the truncated company account I'd opened in a bank under a name that sounded like a storefront, Vintage LLC. I liked how anonymous numbers moved across a ledger, quiet, exact, and how a single memo could rewrite a weekend conversation about bills without anyone ever asking where it came from. The math was simple and the reasons messier. Their mortgage had drifted toward delinquency after a winter of unpaid repairs, the bank notices coming in like small, polite threats, and Emily's private school lines of credit were quietly mounting into something that would swallow them whole. I thought, until I could do more, I would keep them afloat. When the bank sent a final notice about escrow shortfalls, I bumped the deposit up to $8,500 for 3 months straight, the transfer labeled the same way so nobody would connect dots. The extra money stopped the foreclosure clock and bought time, which in that house always felt like its own kind of mercy. Sundays at the table began to tighten into argument territory while the wires stayed invisible. My mother, Susan, would set a dish down and say, voice folded into worry, "I don't know how we're going to keep the house." And my father, James, would sigh in the particular way that meant defeat and avoidance at once. Discussions about selling turned into debates about which realtor would get us top dollar. Nobody looked at the account and said thank you to me, and that absence was a small, hollow thing I learned to carry like a stone. There were bitter ironies I lived with. Emily posting new designer bags on social accounts with glossy photos and captions like "finally comfortable," tagging friends, while in the comment thread she dropped a casual, almost performative line about family help getting us through. That line read like a call for sympathy that cost nothing and gained reassurance. Nobody knew that the comfort she celebrated was subsidized by someone she pretended she had no reason to notice. Aunt Lisa began to brag at family gatherings about the sacrifices she had made, extra shifts, time away from work, her voice seeking credit for things she had not financed but that she wanted to be seen for. Their versions of the story started to harden into entitlement. I held a private satisfaction that was equal parts relief and sourness. I could steady outcomes without applause, pay bills without explanations, feed an engine of denial that everyone else preferred because it kept their shame at bay. But secrecy changed things. It allowed relatives to invent sacrifices and take imagined credit, and it let my parents float in a blend of gratitude and expectation for help they thought temporary. They began to plan in a way that assumed a safety net, not knowing the net was cut from a single private thread I had tied alone. Every anonymous deposit was both a kindness and a cost. It bought the family time, but it also subsidized evasions and small lies that calcified into assumptions. Someone else would fix things, someone else would cover the next shortfall. That thought, how fragile privacy becomes buried leverage, sat in my chest like a warning light. I knew secrets found exits. They leak through conversation, through greedy suggestions, and through a single accidental display of numbers. I had put a floor under their lives for years, but I also knew in the marrow that a single open laptop on a Thanksgiving table would change everything, that the quiet generosity I practiced could become an argument weapon when exposed. The lesson felt like a conditional mercy. I could choose to keep giving, but I could not let generosity become a door they would walk through to demand more. Emily flips the laptop around like she's peeling a bandage, and the room goes loud with 1,000 small judgments that sound like wind through thin glass. The screen still shows the business reserves header and the numbers everyone decided were proof of some private theft. But I see more. The months of anonymous transfers that had kept their lights on, the $6,200 and later $8,500 entries labeled household assistance, and the ledger entries that explain why foreclosure notices stopped arriving. Emily reads it and her face closes into a challenge. She points at the balance and names a number like it's a demand and not a question. $2,000,000 right now, Alex. That's what you owe me to start my life. The room folds into negotiation immediately, with Mom and Dad chiming in for a beach house down payment and Uncle Mark listing retirement figures as if the account were a family ATM. Claims are made in the blunt language of entitlement. My mother says, "We raised you, you can't just hide this," with a voice that expects leverage rather than explanation, and my father tries to make guilt sound like policy. People suffered and we never asked for help. Aunt Lisa starts naming favors she supposedly gave like they were receipts for future invoices. The table becomes an ugly list of petty demands: Emily's launch pad, Mom and Dad's vacation home, Uncle Mark's nest egg. The family tries to translate the private ledger into collective ownership, as if my silence had been an implicit trust fund. I feel my chest go hollow and then fill with a clarity that surprises me. Years of being reduced to invisible suddenly turn into an ability to act without the old knots of guilt. I reach for my phone, thumb moving like something practiced, and cancel the monthly wire as people talk, watching the transaction screen flash a confirmation and then blink gone. There is an audible gasp around the table, a tiny acoustic punctuation that sounds almost relieved and almost enraged at once. Someone says, "What did you just do?" like they've been handed a verdict. I call Jenna and tell her, plainly and fast, to place Mom and Dad's names on our building's do not admit list and to hold the lobby if they show up. 10 minutes later, the surreal image happens. My 60-year-old mother, damp with the last wash of kitchen steam and clutching a dish towel like a talisman, is stopped at the lobby desk and gently escorted out by building security. She looks bewildered as if the world itself has betrayed her, and my family in the dining room erupts with shouts calling me ungrateful, cruel, and reckless. Their voices sound small and animal, the kind of noise people make when their assumptions scatter. I don't let panic rule me. I call Mr. Bennett and then my attorney, the two voices that ground me in procedure. We prepare a formal notice to be delivered, clear language about harassment, trespass, and the right to a safe workplace, with the backing of a lawyer's letterhead that reads like a lock. I instruct Jenna to forward any attempted contact from family members to our legal inbox. The first hour after the laptop reveal becomes another kind of storm. My phone lights up with 63 missed calls in a row, and my group thread fills with a flood of angry messages demanding access, explanation, and immediate payments. A cousin posts an ugly, breathless smear to a neighborhood page calling me a hoarder and greedy, and the accusation spreads like a stain. I file harassment warnings and send cease and desist letters. I do not call the police. There is a brutal calculus in that choice. Criminal charges would escalate the family drama into a public spectacle I do not want, and I do not want to weaponize the law against my blood unless forced. Instead, I lock down access, change account signatories, route client communications through counsel, and tighten physical and digital security for the business. The steps are boring, necessary, and precise. New bank accounts under the firm's trust, multi-factor authentication on every device, a formal receptionist policy that requires appointments, and a do not admit list maintained by building security with legal backup. There is a personal collapse in the minutes after the shouting, an old grief of being misunderstood, and then a hardening as I remember why I built this life quietly. The choice I make is legal restraint over emotional capitulation. It is a line that looks like coldness to them but like survival to me. I will not be guilted into undoing the years of work that bought my family time and my own freedom. The final image of the night is simple and clean. I close my briefcase in the car outside the house, the engine idling, and I breathe. I have filed warnings, I have built legal walls, and I will redirect my energy into securing the business and rebuilding in private. The family will howl, smear, and demand, but I have learned to keep a ledger that answers to law and to honor, not to imposed obligation. Months later, I wake before dawn more often than not, and the house I bought has shutters that lock from the inside and a security code the size of a phone number, a small set of defenses that make me feel tidy. I moved out of the old neighborhood, signed a mortgage in my name without explanation, and learned to like windows that shut the world out when I needed safety. The ledger on my desk is neat now, closed and filed, and that order feels like permission. My company grew the hard way into 3 offices: Columbus, Chicago, and New York, each one rented cheap at first and then upgraded when clients who valued discretion started to appear. Word traveled oddly after the Thanksgiving story. Collectors and families who needed quiet appraisals sought someone who guarded privacy fiercely, who wouldn't turn their grief into clickbait. That demand made us grow, not by showing off but by tightening rules. Appointment-only consultations, client NDAs, and paper trails that led nowhere public. Jenna is the head authenticator now, promoted from the card table days, and she has a permanent equity share that makes her part owner in a way my family never became part of me. She signs reports with a steady hand, hires conservators, and drinks bad diner coffee with the same pragmatic joy I used to. I paid her in trust the way Carol paid me once with leftover pie, and I made that trust into real ownership because talent should not be borrowed. It should be made safe. We gave back where it mattered. I wrote a 6-figure bonus check to Carol at Frank's Diner, $125,000, no strings, so she could fix the roof and buy a new walk-in fridge. Her laugh when I handed the envelope felt like a benediction, not charity, and she still slips me an extra slice of pie from time to time like a talisman. I started a small endowed scholarship at my old high school in Mr. Patel's name to help kids with practical interests get to college. A quiet fund that pays for tuition and train tickets, and Mr. Patel cried once when I told him. The controversy that had felt like a wound turned into a weird kind of proof. People paid for someone who wouldn't gawk or take sides. High-profile clients admired that we kept quiet and kept standards. We built a portfolio of estates that valued discretion as much as accuracy, and our reputation turned into steady work rather than spectacle. That work let me repay debts to people who had been there when I needed them and invest in staff who deserved permanence. I did not flaunt money to my family or buy revenge. I never turned up at Thanksgiving with a rare necklace on display or a check to shame them into gratitude. Instead, I bought permanency for those who had been loyal, permanent equity for Jenna, a trust account for Carol, and small stable grants to people who had quietly suffered or believed in me. The choices felt moral, precise, and merciful in a way guilt never is. Grandma Ruth called one afternoon and said in her slow country voice, "I always knew you wouldn't let the pieces go to waste." And when she visited, we spread pieces on the table and cataloged a small estate together. Her hands trembled the way they always had, and she labeled things in my handwriting and then in hers, a small note of pride taped to the box. She put a permanent sticker inside her old jewelry box that reads, "Alex, thank you," and that sticker is my favorite ledger entry. Emily keeps her social campaign about toxic wealth where she posts long threads about accountability, and she tried to start her own authentication business afterward but could not build the standards or the quiet discipline it requires. I see her posts, I scan press clippings, and I file them away like evidence. The work itself is exacting and reputational. It cannot be hollered into being. She failed to attract the right mentors, and I do not gloat. At dawn, pouring coffee at my kitchen window, I think of that Thanksgiving night and how I left the table tired rather than theatrical, how the choice to walk away became the hinge that opened something else. The release felt like removing a bandage, brief pain, then air, then slow healing. I chose boundaries and dignity, and I chose where to give my energy, not to punish them, but to preserve my life. The ledger is closed. Ruth's jewelry box sits labeled on a shelf with a permanent note of gratitude, and I feel properly like a man who has finally learned whom he will keep and why.